we should talk about net zero,
yes.
climate change, because I know this is a very important topic for you.
Well, of course, our business energy prices are the highest in the world, bar none. This is solely because of the useless Miliband and his net zero policies. They're getting away with it because the media are allowed to take the Communist Party line on this and never to allow the other side to be heard.
I think if Reform win and Nigel delivers for the country and is bold and brave, I don't see a role for the Conservatives anymore.
Nigel is now beginning to get into policy areas that really weren't his own before. They got into all these local council areas. They went right down to the grassroots. They built organisations in all these different council areas. I mean, it was an astonishing logistical achievement. And I'm going to say when rather than if they win the next election. They will act that fast to restore our country too. I think that they can do it. Something like a skull, or is it Gollum? I can't.
Yeah, that's a skull.
Right.
So when I went to get that tattoo, Jordan, I went with this idea of this intricate timepiece. He went, "No, we're going to put a skull there." I went, okay. So we got a skull.
Right.
But they're everywhere. They're all over my chest, legs, and just one of those things.
Crikey.
Connor's got his first two.
Have you? You're going to do like your dad and cover yourself in them?
Yeah, not in the same way. Prefer dotted about.
You don't want to be covered completely. It's better for you just to have a few than to have lots. And you want to make sure there's at least one mathematical puzzle to keep people amused when they see it. Yeah. No, I'm too old for that sort of thing.
I don't. We can go and get one after this.
No, not for me.
My daughter wants her first one. She's 15. So anyway, we started the interview. Good to meet you. Thank you for coming in.
Well, it's a huge pleasure to be here. I'm an enormous fan of your show, which of course has been copied by Joe Rogan. He uses the same format.
I've heard about this young whippersnapper Joe Rogan. No, he's fantastic. He's our Michael Jordan. He's the one we all aspire to.
Well, you're there, mate.
Well, we're trying. You know, it's we live in strange times, and I think we need places where people can come and talk openly, where Ofcom don't regulate us, and we can have an honest conversation.
Yes, the Office for Communism has really no place in Britain. It's one of the first things, when the red carpet of destiny is unrolled before my feet and the people plead that I should take charge and lead them to the promised land, the first obstacle that I shall kick out of the way is the Office for Communism. You know why? Because it has decreed that on the climate, which is one of the things I play with, the science is settled, and that therefore the BBC and ITV, Channel 4 and Sky TV are entitled to give only the wrong side of the story. They are not required to be impartial. And this has its benefits, as I was explaining to the management at GB News the other day, because it means that Ofcom now cannot prevent GB News from taking a pro-reality and therefore anti-the climate nonsense stance, because once they have issued a judgment and made the cause of climate their own by publishing in one of their documents that the science is settled, they can no longer act in a judicial capacity against any broadcaster who chooses to give the proper side of the story. They have no power to do so under one of the most ancient principles of natural law, which is that none shall be the judge in a cause that he has made his own. Nemo sit iudex in causa propria.
What a start. We could talk about the Office of Communism. I've never actually heard it referred to that, but it's pretty fitting. I do want to talk about climate with you, but I do want to ask you one thing first, because I often, as I said to you earlier, I often talk to my son about Lady Thatcher. And she was a prime minister when I was born. I was born in 1978, and so as a child, that's all I remember was Margaret Thatcher to John Major. But I've gone back and watched a lot of her old speeches, and my favourite one of her speeches, I refer to in the show a lot, is where she talked about the government doesn't have any money, only has your money, which is the people's money, and we must respect that. And so what I really wanted to ask you, because you were an advisor of hers, what do you think she would make of the state of our country right now? And the Conservative Party.
She would weep for her country and for her party, because her party decided to deviate. I mean, it got rid of her at the very height of her powers and success and replaced her with John Major, who immediately reversed most of what she did. And then came Tony Blair, who undid 1,000 years of constitutional history and has now left the civil service all powerful, and ministers, which we elect, have no power anymore. Parliament that we elect has no power. It's a mere Duma. And of course, now Mr. Starmer is not only busy giving away sovereign territory and paying the communists to take it from us, but is also handing all our powers away to the European Court of Human Rights, which again is communist dominated. It's woke in the extreme. So we no longer have control of our own borders. How did she deal with the border question? It was really good. Very early on in her premiership, a question was planted with a backbench MP who got up and said, how was she going to control immigration? And she said, if anyone who has not asked first comes into this country, they will be sent straight back where they came from, and they will be put in prison in the meantime, and it will be uncomfortable for them. We're not having it, she said. And the message went out, and the boats stopped coming, and there was no more nonsense. But Starmer, of course, this is the thing with the communists. They want a lot of immigrants to come in because the first 2 generations of immigrants vote left. They just do. It's the same in America. That's why Biden, first thing he did was to open the borders and say, come on in, all of you. You're very welcome. And they came pouring in, I think something like 8 or 10 million. Nobody seems to know for sure. And the same thing is now happening here. There have been 45,000 as of today, just this year, which is a new record high. But that's only the boat people. Then there are all the ones who are coming in by net immigration. And last year, for the first time, there were 685 to 720,000. Again, nobody seems to know exactly. Net immigrants, not counting the boat people. And that exceeds the number of live births, which was 600,000. So she would have been horrified at that. She would have been horrified at the state of the economy, because one of the things that I worked on very hard when I was in her office was that if anyone wanted new money, because the civil service were always trying to dream up schemes for expanding their empires, and they'd get their ministers to say, we need this, we need that. I got a system going by which if anyone wanted new money, it had to come across my desk before it went to the cabinet. And about 98% of these proposals were just so bonkers that I turned them down flat before they even got to the cabinet. And after a bit, in the weekly sort of morning prayers session at the Treasury, where they were working out what they were going to throw at us next, some new fatuous proposal for spending other people's money would come up. And then somebody would say, oh no, Monckton won't like that. And in the end, they just stopped sending them. And within a year, that's all it took, a year of doing that, we were paying back the national debt for the first time in 200 years. And had she stayed in office another 4 years, the whole of the then national debt, which was only $100 billion in then money, I suppose it'd be about 4 or 5 times that now, would have been paid back. And we were then going to abolish income tax. And that's why the left of the party was so desperate to get rid of her, because if we'd done that, then this would have been the best place on the in the world to be working class, because you wouldn't pay tax on the earnings of the sweat of your brow.
Wow.
And this would have forever destroyed communism in this country, because the workers would then have realized you really were better off under a Tory government, because you weren't even having to pay income tax. And we were that close when the left of the party blew it apart, with considerable help from the civil service, who, of course, are instinctually totalitarian. And they didn't like the libertarian, easygoing, free market, let people do their own thing, on your bike, go and find a job somewhere else if you can't find one where you live. That kind of attitude, it's all gone.
Yeah.
And she would be very upset. But on the other hand, she was not only the best informed economist that has ever been Prime Minister. I once indexed her library of books about economics because she asked me to. And I'd read several of them myself. But there they all were. You had Ricardo, you had Frédéric Bastiat, the journalist economist. You had
Wrote the law.
Yeah, absolutely. And you had Adam Smith, of course, and you had, of course, Friedrich August von Hayek, whom I met, and what a god of economics he was.
I'm reading The Fatal Conceit at the moment. I think it's in my bag.
Oh, well, that'll be wonderful. And, of course, also The Constitution of Liberty. You must read that. It's the most beautiful of all his works. And, of course, Milton Friedman, whom I also met. And she had read these, and in pencil she had marked all the passages of interest to her, all the way through all the books. She'd read them all and mastered them all. She actually understood, therefore, how macroeconomics works. And she was the only Prime Minister, certainly in my time, and I think in any age, that actually knew that. And that's why it all came right under her. Because if anyone came along and suggested something half-baked, she would already know enough economics to know it wasn't going to work, and to know why it wasn't going to work, and to explain to them why it wasn't going to work. And then she'd tell them to go and think again, and if necessary, to read the right textbook of economics so that they understood it too. So she really was strikingly competent. And I suppose to sum up her government, I had dinner some years ago with Robert Armstrong, now Lord Armstrong, who had been the head of the Home Civil Service, had sat just to her left in Cabinet. And he was the most senior civil servant of his time. And he suddenly turned to me at dinner and he said, "You know, Christopher," he said, "that government that you served," he said, "it was a good government." Whenever you get the civil service using a moral term, you have to ask them what they mean by it. So I said, "What do you mean by good?" He said, "Well, the first thing, unique in my long experience in government, is that you were all competent. You actually knew what you were doing." But he said it's more than that. This was also a morally good government. So I said, define morally good. He said the most striking thing about all of you, from Margaret downwards, is that none of you meant anyone any harm. You weren't there to get your back at the communists or get back at the unions. No. You wanted the workers to have more rights over their unions. You wanted the workers to do better financially, to own their houses, to own shares, to be able to choose which school their kid went to. And this was a very fresh take on conservatism, he said. And he said, that's why I say you were morally good. You genuinely did love your country. And this came through in everything that Margaret Thatcher said or did. And I thought that, from a tough, cynical civil servant, was a most remarkable and, frankly, very generous thing to say. But I also think, from my experience of Margaret Thatcher, that it was very much fair comment.
Huh. I feel like the downward trajectory of this country, I feel like it started from the loss of Thatcher. I feel like that was the turning point with things of over the last 3 decades have just gradually got worse. And trying to, I've got a 21-year-old son who's in the workplace now.
Yeah,
he's paying tax, wants to buy a house, can't afford it.
No chance.
No. Trying to help him understand why we want small government, why libertarian principles are important, why he should read Hayek. How would you explain it to him?
The humble bee, a keystone species crucial to the survival of Earth's inhabitants. Here's how things would look if bees vanished. And here's how they'd look if humans vanished. But imagine if instead we became a keystone species by doing things the right way, by taking responsibility for our actions and becoming the solution. Iron mines, the world's most responsible currency, the right way. because the future depends on it.
I think you need to have a philosophy of government. And the philosophy of government that Margaret had was essentially Judeo-Christian. Why do I say Judeo-Christian? Because what is the central word in the philosophy of Christianity? You tell me.
I don't want to guess.
Go on.
I don't. Faith?
Love.
Love. Okay.
Yeah. Thou shalt love. Where does that come from? It doesn't come from the New Testament. It comes from Leviticus, from the original 5 books of the Old Testament, the Pentateuch. And that concept of loving God and loving your neighbour, that came to us from Judaism. And so I suppose if you used a couplet to summarise the philosophy of the Thatcher government, it would be this: in God's good earth, like as in heaven above, there stands but one commandment: thou shalt love. And when we talk of libertarianism, what are we really saying? We're not just saying, let it be a chaotic, anarchistic, free-for-all. We're saying that if we remove the barriers and allow people to love one another and work in friendly cooperation with one another, rather than under some hate-filled totalitarian regime, then they will enjoy themselves more, they will keep more of what is theirs, they will be able, like your son, to afford a house, as I was. I mean, even in my day, I think I got my first house when I was 32, I think, because even in my day it was getting expensive, particularly in London. But if you have a much, much smaller machine of government, doing much, much less, and allowing the people to do much, much more, they will spend their own money far more wisely than we will. And as Margaret used to say, the trouble with socialism is that in the end, you run out of other people's money.
Yep.
And that's one of my favourite quotations from her. And when she uses the word socialism, of course, what she's really meaning is communism.
Yeah.
Because the end and object of socialism is communism. And the end and object of communism is mass death. I was away just for 2 days last week in Paris at a climate conference, which was very much a left-wing climate conference, but I sometimes go to those so that they get to hear the other side of the story. But when I came back, I found that the communists here, true to form, were going to increase the number of babies butchered in human abattoirs. And if I were to try to protest about that, even by going to the local one in Bristol or the local one in Bath, which is just 10 minutes walk from the Royal Crescent, and I were to be seen with my hands like this, looking up and saying a prayer, I could be arrested for that, imprisoned, interviewed, brought up before the beak the next morning, and made to pay between 10 and 20,000 pounds for opposing the idea that we can just kill little babies without even giving them their anaesthetic first. There is a failure of love of the worst possible kind. And if I may, I'm going to tell you a little story about this, because I was contacted by a guy who had just been arrested by the police in Scotland. And he said, I don't know what to do. They've accused me of possessing pornography on my computer. And he said the trouble was there was some pornography on my computer. I didn't know it was there because it was a very old computer. It was XP, and some bot had pushed this nonsense onto it. He didn't even know it was there. But the police had tracked it from the other end, arrested him, interviewed him for 13 hours without a lawyer, let him out into the street, miles from his own home, at the middle of the night, no taxi, nothing. He had to walk home. And he's my kind of age, and for some folk my age, that's not an easy thing to do. And they then prosecuted him, and he was found guilty, even though he clearly wasn't. And I tried to intervene with the court. I said, look, I'm overseas, but I'll come back if you can just put the hearing back by a week so I can come and speak for him. They wouldn't let me. And they found him guilty. And then violence was done on him in front of the sheriff as he was leaving the dock. And the sheriff did nothing. So I then, to try to sort him out, interviewed him over several days, kind of interview that you do, just getting him to talk. And I discovered what had happened to him. He had the worst case of post-traumatic stress disorder that I had ever seen, and the various psychiatrists that had seen him over the years had completely missed it because he had buried the index trauma so deeply in his mind. It had happened 40 years ago. He had a girlfriend, he'd just got her pregnant. She'd gone away for a few days. He was the chief technician at Edinburgh University. And he had been told that he was to spend 10 days filming the performance of abortions by various techniques. And he sat there weeping as he watched these horrendous procedures taking place. And one in particular horrified him, because he was behind a glass plate and he was filming through the glass plate, and he had the professor sitting next to him, and then there was a guy actually doing the butchering. And so a baby came out alive and was cast carelessly into a kidney dish. And the baby was moving, twitching. He saw it moving, and he said to the professor, look, that baby is not dead, it's alive. And the professor said, no, it's dead. No, it's alive. I can see it moving. And sure enough, when he looked at the footage later, it had been moving. But the baby, having been born alive, was left to die. And that, even under the new Starmer disposition, kill them all, is still murder. But what then happened to him was this. He went home, and his girlfriend returned, and she said, I hadn't actually gone to see some relatives, I'd gone to get an abortion. And just after he'd seen this poor kid killed, and his spirit broke, and he ended up living in a shed on Leith Docks, where eventually 20 years later a social worker got to hear about him and found him and put him in social housing, where he's been ever since. And then the police come in middle of the morning and do this to him. Actually, it was 7 o'clock in the morning, bang on the door and do this to him. And so I wrote to the court and I said, I'm reasonably satisfied, even though I have no training in psychiatry. I have had some experience of it because I learnt a bit sitting at the foot of the professor of it at King's College London. I know a little bit about it. He's clearly got PTSD. This was the index trauma. Here's the story. Here are other traumata which also came out. He had not remembered this for 40 years until I got it out of him, because I have certain training in interrogation techniques and I know how to get stuff out of people if I have to. And I said he needs psychiatric treatment. His local surgery would not make the arrangements. The National Health Service would not make the arrangement. I tried to get him treated privately, but they wouldn't touch him because he'd been accused of this foul offence. That the great thing is, if you've got PTSD, you can't be held guilty of any such offence. So I explained this in writing to the sheriff, who said that I had not provided any argument. They just don't, forgive me, I'm going to use a rude word, they don't bloody care. That's what's happened. When you get these communists taking over, they do not see people as people anymore. They do not love them. And the people who are at the bottom of the heap, the people who've gone through what this poor lad had gone through, they are the people that it is our duty in the governing class to love the most. You cannot just say, well, he's been accused of this embarrassingly nasty offence, therefore we will not help him because we don't want to be tainted. That's the attitude they all displayed. I even wrote to Lord Carlaway, who is the senior judge in Scotland, and said, please, will you get off your wobbly bottom and intervene? And he wrote back and said, no, I bloody won't, or words to that effect. And that is Britain today. When you have a governing machine that is as ruthless and uncaring as that, which will allow babies to be killed without even getting an anaesthetic first. You know when the spinal cord of a little baby forms? 2 weeks gestation. At any time after that, it will have some sense of pain. By 12, 15 weeks, you can actually see, if you do the scan, you can see the baby shrinking away when those forceps come in and try to grab it and pull it out piecemeal, no anaesthetic. It is conscious while this is being done. And nobody bloody cares. Now, you might say, but what about the woman and the rights of the woman? The rights of the little child come first because it is the weaker. And the rights of the woman are this. If you are seeing this and you are thinking of killing your baby because for any reason it's difficult for you, and goodness knows it's not easy these days bringing a kid up, I understand that. Just go to any building which has a cross with a figure on it, because that will be a Catholic church. Find the priest and say, I've got a kid that I don't think I'll be able to look after, and I don't want to kill it. Will you find the kid a good home? And that priest will always find the kid a good home, because there's an enormous Catholic charity called the Catholic Rescue Society, which will find really good homes, not necessarily Catholic homes, but just homes where the parents will look after the kid along with their own kids, and it will get a loving and proper upbringing. You do not need to kill your child just because it's difficult for you to bring that child up. So that's what I mean by a practical demonstration of loving one's fellow man, however small that little creature is. It isn't just a fetus, it is a baby. It has unique DNA, and when by meiosis, the process by which the DNA of the two parents comes together, a new, unique code of DNA for a new, unique person comes into being at that moment. And if we do not value human life even before birth, as Pope Stephen said when a bishop said, can we kill a kid that's born handicapped? And the Pope wrote back and said, no, you can't. You must give the kid its chance of life. And I've met many handicapped children who would have been aborted if their parents had done what the doctors told them. And I can tell you they're very, very grateful that they're alive. They don't mind being handicapped. They'd rather be handicapped and alive than just dead. So I think that there's a failure of love right at the heart of politics in this country. You can see it most visibly on the abortion question. But on many others too. I mean, you look at the communist regime in Russia, because of course Putin took over by force from Yeltsin. When Yeltsin came back from his Christmas holiday at the beginning of 2000, he was arrested, taken to Lubyanka. There was Putin with a single piece of paper saying, sign this, hand all authority over to me, and we'll let you go. And that's what he did. He signed. That's how Putin took over. And within 3 years, according to the former head of the disinformation directorate of the KGB, who came out to the West in 1978 and told us everything, he had appointed 6,000 former KGB mates. That's how big the KGB was, to all the senior positions in Russia. So it's essentially a communist-run country, even though it never was a communist country at the ordinary level. And they are now busy. How many people have been killed? Perhaps 1 million on each side, something like that, in the Ukraine invasion. Vlad the invader. They just don't care on the communist left about human life at all.
They claim they do.
But you wouldn't kill in the numbers they have. If you look at the history of communism, which is the nastiest of all the forms of totalitarianism, it has killed between 130 million and 250 million people just in 100 years. And that is more people killed than by all other regimes of every kind since we came down out of the trees. You're too young to remember, but 2.1 million years ago, added together. That is how brutally murderous communism is. Even fascism doesn't come close. And of course, fascism, like communism, is a left-wing, totalitarian, kill them all movement. But do they teach that in the schools, that communism kills? Of course they don't.
Nope.
They try to make out that it's caring and sharing, that it protects the workers. Of course it doesn't. The last people it protects are the proletariat, whom both Lenin and Stalin treated with the utmost contempt. So if you're working class and you think communism is going to help you, think again, mate. If it doesn't kill you, it certainly won't make your life better. And so Margaret Thatcher had a very strong sense of just how evil the left is. And she saw it, therefore, as morally necessary that the left should be kept out of office and that the workers could get real help by getting taxes down, deregulating the economy, letting businesses spring up and do business. And what was interesting was that in Ireland, there was a wonderful thing that happened, because there was a great, great statesman, Garret Fitzgerald, who was the Taoiseach of Ireland, the Prime Minister of Ireland. And he made the most remarkable offer, the most statesmanlike offer I've ever seen to Margaret Thatcher. He said, look, we will abandon our claim to sovereignty over the whole of Ireland, which is written into the Irish Constitution, if in return you will agree that you and your successors will have a cup of tea with a Taoiseach once a month or so to discuss matters of mutual interest. That was how asymmetric the Anglo-Irish agreement was in favour of the United Kingdom. And it absolutely destroyed the IRA, because suddenly it had no legitimacy whatsoever. And the IRA was the focus of communism in Ireland. It was a communist movement. It was communist-led, communist-funded, communist-trained. Both Gerry Adams and the other guy whose name I forget. Martin McGuinness. They were both trained at the Lenin Institute in Moscow. And if you look up the now communist-controlled Wikipedia, you will find that the Lenin Institute is described as the library of communism. But it's not the library of communism. It's the place where the world's terrorist leaders are trained. And that's where Arthur Scargill, the miners' leader, was trained for 5 months in 1979, so that he was ready to do the miners' strike that was due to happen in 1982, but it had to be put back because of the Falklands victory, so they pushed it back to 1984. But the communists have been interfering in this country at every level for getting on for 100 years. And they regard this country as particularly important because of its connections with America, with Europe, and of course with the Commonwealth. So our reach internationally is far greater than our size and our current economic performance would lead you to expect. And that's why the communists have always been particularly interested in this country. And now we have yet again a communist government. It calls itself socialist, but then all communists call themselves socialist. And here they are killing babies and then killing old people. They'll be killing me next.
They'll be coming for you.
Yeah, that's it. And they say, well, of course, this will be just assisted dying. No, it's not. It's assisted suicide. It's assisted slaughter. It's kill, kill, kill.
It's a death cult.
It is, and I think we need to replace the word totalitarianism with the nice Greek word thanatism, which is from the Greek thanatos, dead. It's the death cult. That's what leftism is, and it doesn't matter whether it's the fascist presentation or the communist presentation, or you can water it down and call it socialist. Death is what they are all about, and death is the very reverse of being loving, and that's why I think that at the heart of any proper political philosophy, there must be love. That is the absolute centre of it. If you don't have that, then you're going to have its opposite, which is hate. And if you don't have truth, you get its opposite, which is lies. And that is why you get not good, but bad under a communist or fascist or other kind of totalitarian regime. We're also going to have to learn how to deal with Islamism, because not only the Quran, but also the hadiths by which it is interpreted contain multiple expressions of hatred, first of all, for anyone who is not Muslim, the infidel, and some very lurid accounts of what will happen to the infidels are to be found in the Quran. It is hate speech in the most literal sense. The Quran is probably illegal under the current hate speech laws, but of course nobody dares to raise that question for fear of what might happen to them if they did.
We can raise it here.
Well, I am raising it here. And then, of course, also there is their bitter cruelty to anyone who wishes no longer to be in Islam. If you are an apostate, using the Greek word for one who stands away from Islam, then both the Quran and the Hadith prescribe that you shall be killed. That's the penalty. And that, too, is not compatible with the gentle, loving Judeo-Christian disposition in this country. Now, listening to this, you may think, God, this guy Monckton, he's really extreme. But all I'm doing is pointing out what's actually in the Quran. I once used the database of religious texts at the University of Michigan, which it's searchable online, to find out how often the word love appears in the Quran. And it appears a lot fewer times than just in the Gospel of St. John. And in most of those occasions, it is saying, Allah doth not love this and doth not love that and doth hate the other. So this is not a religion of love, unfortunately. It is a religion which is a Thanatist cult. It is a religion of hatred, whereas Judaism and Christianity are religions of love. And even then, if you look at the history of both of those, there's been a certain amount of smiting and killing that we shouldn't have done if we were following our own religion. But the smiting and killing that happens in Islam is happening because that is what the Quran and the Hadith tell them to do. That's the difference. At least in Christianity, if we start going around killing people, we know that we're acting against what the Lord of Life told us to do. But in the Quran, it says that's what you should do. And that's a problem. It's a real problem because so large is the rate of immigration, including from Islamic countries, and they don't kill their babies because their imams are telling them, you must use the power of the womb. The Western decadent Judeo-Christians, they are killing all their babies. You are not to kill yours. You are to have large families. So you not only get them coming in, but then they are outbreeding us. There's no quicker way to kill off a civilization than to kill your children. That's what we're doing. And they are consciously exploiting this. If you go to a mosque, you can hear them preaching this, that they are to have as many babies as they can because they aim to take us over by sheer force of numbers. Now, you may say, well, in democracy, that's how it works. But I don't think any of us voted that quite so many members of this really, at root, cruel religion. It was founded out of war. It was spread by force and war. I don't think any of us voted to have this in our country in such large quantities. But does this mean we should hate Islam? No, it doesn't. The rule of love is absolute. We must love them even though they may hate us, because that in the end is what defeats the hate. So what I am not doing is preaching hatred against Islam, because that's not how it is. And I know I studied the classical texts at Cambridge, Latin and Greek. Very nearly all of those texts would have been lost to the world altogether had they not been found when the Christians finally expelled the Muslims from southern Spain in the library at Cordoba, the great Muslim library at Cordoba. All these ancient texts were preserved there and would have been lost to the world had they not preserved them. Because during the great period of Islamic scholarship, which was between the 9th and the 11th centuries under the Umayyad dynasty, there was freedom of thought, very large extent, freedom of religious expression as well, freedom of scientific research. And that was an enormous golden age of scholarship, the like of which has probably not really been seen ever since. I mean, yes, the Renaissance did its bit later on, but really that golden age of Islamic scholarship, that's where we got mathematics from in anything like its recognizable form, astronomy likewise, optics likewise. There was Abu Ali Ibn al-Hasan, Ibn al-Hasan, Ibn al-Husayn, Ibn al-Haytham. He was as proud of his ancestry as I am of mine. And he was the Newton of the East. He studied optics. He formulated the scientific method more beautifully than it was ever done in the West by calling the scientist the seeker after truth. So in Islam, there is the capacity for truth and love and understanding. And so our response to this religion, which at the moment comes across as a religion of hate, must be to love it relentlessly, to understand that it has not just a few good points, but a philosophy behind it, much of which is wonderful, including the philosophy which brings us the scientific method as we know it today. So we have a lot to thank the Muslims for too. And so one must balance the hatred expressed in the Quran and in the Hadiths with the love and the scholarship and the knowledge that so many members of that faith display despite the unfavourable environment for it, which so often surrounds them. So this is a problem we're going to have to deal with, because the fabric of British society cannot survive if it is built on communist hate in one direction and Islamicist hate in another. We have to get back to that simple commandment, thou shalt love.
Do we have to even love the Labour front bench?
We even have to love them too. There's a wonderful phrase, bless their little cotton socks. Look at them as though they were babies, because intellectually that's about the level they've reached, bless them. And yes, we must love them too. We must pray for them. We must do our best for them to make them see that the deliberate destruction of Britain in which they're now engaged is not going to benefit the communist cause that they so deeply and proudly, but alas misguidedly, espouse. It's not going to help them to destroy Britain. That will merely serve as yet another example of the consequences of thanatism.
Why does socialism keep coming back?
You see, if you have a governing system of whatever kind, it has to take charge. So to some extent it is instinctually totalitarian. It is instinctually wanting to have all power in its own hands. And it takes somebody with the both religious convictions and philosophical background and intellectual rigour and economic skill of Margaret Thatcher to understand that actually if you stand away a bit and let the British people speak and act for themselves and let them decide how they spend their money, actually the country will be better for that than if you try to rule them with a rod of iron, as the communists now do, and as the Islamicists would also do if they get the chance. We've seen this in the policies of the Mayor of London, Mr. Carr. What is he doing? Everywhere he's commanding that there should be 15-minute cities, roads should be blocked off, cycle paths should be put in, dirigisme of the most extreme, rather than the cheerful chaos that used to exist, and which Londoners would, if you get down to it, much prefer. But of course, we're gradually being outnumbered in many major cities by the Muslims now. It's unlikely we'll ever see another non-Muslim mayor. And so we're going to have to get used to this authoritarian, totalitarian, and eventually possibly even thanatist, once they get their boots really under the table, once they become the majority in about 2050. Then, and we've seen this in many other Islamic countries, suddenly they actually begin to implement thanatist policies. You follow Islam or else, and if you apostatize from Islam, we'll kill you, as they're doing in Iran now. And so somehow it would be nice if we could manage to get the communist and the fascist and the totalitarians of every kind, of the Islamicists, to realize that the way of love is a better way. It actually works more efficiently. I was talking to a very senior group the other day about this, and they were saying it all sounds a bit wet, all this stuff about love. I said, oh no, don't you think that for a moment. It works best. Well, how do you know? Because we did it under Margaret Thatcher. And the economy came right, and people were happier, and people were proud to be British. My sister was visited a remote sort of mountain in the back end of Peru somewhere up in the forest, and there was a tribe that had barely ever had contact with the rest of the human race, and she arrived, and when they discovered she came from Britain, they immediately spoke 2 words: Margaret Thatcher, they said. That was the impact that she had, because she did not subscribe to the totalitarian view of how you govern, but instead to this much more easygoing, much more affectionate, much more trusting way of looking at things. And in fact, John Milton, who was one of our greatest poets, put this rather well when he was addressing a pamphlet to Parliament, saying that they should take away the tax on books. He said you shouldn't tax learning. And he prevailed in this, and until the current communist government decided to tax private schools, that had held for hundreds of years, ever since Milton's time. And this is how he began his address to Parliament. He said this: Lords and Commons of England, consider what nation it is whereof ye are the governors. A nation not slow and dull, but of a quick, ingenious and piercing spirit, acute to invent, subtle and sinewy to discourse, not beneath the greatest point that human capacity can soar to. That was how he viewed his fellow countrymen. There is somebody who loved his fellow countrymen, realized that you should not tax education, that you should favour it, so that they could have the benefits of education that he had had. And he prevailed in that argument because they could see that he loved his country. So love actually works in politics, and it works more powerfully and more unstoppably than anything else. Because you can see this in a curious way in Nigel Farage, interestingly. You know, why does he have this bloke down the pub image? Because nothing more powerfully says, I love you, mate, than that I'm willing to come and have a drink with you in the pub, just like anyone else. Now, most politicians are too damn poncy and remote to do that. But he does that, and he takes his pint and he drinks it like a man. Not many politicians could probably even do that these days, but he does it. And he is effectively saying to the people, yes, you are my people, and I am your person. I'm your man. And it worked. It's working in spades. Just look at the effect on the opinion polls. You know, he's at the point now where he's certainly going to be the largest party at the next election. And if it carries on as it's carrying on, then he will get to the point where he gets an outright majority. He's not quite there yet. He'd need the Conservatives and a few others on the latest polls. But he got there by loving his country and the people thereof so much that he gave up his very successful career in the city, led UKIP, took it by the throat and really made it spin. And it was he, pretty much single-handed, who got us Brexit. It was an astonishing achievement for somebody who at that time didn't even sit in Parliament. He managed to use the European Parliament as his soapbox. Just did it brilliantly. And he had them all on the back foot all the time. And every time one of those puddings in the European Commission, the commissars, as the Germans so accurately describe them, because they are effectively the unelected, all-powerful Politburo of Europe is the Commission. He would just look at, some dreadful little character like Jacques Delors or one of these other puddings, and he would say, "Who elected you?" And they sat there. They didn't know what to say or where to look. Because here's a guy who believes in government of the people, by the people, and for the people. Now, in order to believe in that, you have to love the people, because otherwise that would be one hell of a disaster, wouldn't it? And so in everything that he does and everything that he stands for, he shows that he loves the people. He's not the sort to use the word love. He won't wear it on his sleeve. But it's there nevertheless. And it's that, above all else, to which people respond when they respond to him. You know, if you look at the fun that the newspapers are making of their various economic policies, they're not buying into the Farage brand because of his economic policies. They're buying into the Farage brand because they know that once he gets his feet under the table as Prime Minister, he will make sure that those economic policies work sensibly so as to benefit the people. They can trust him to do that. And in fact, if the largely Thanatist press were to do a little more homework, they would find out that Reform's manifesto at the last election was costed more carefully than all the other manifestos put together. Richard Tice was in charge of that, and he made a first-class job of it. He took a lot of trouble. You have no idea how much trouble. I mean, they work so hard, these people. They really do. And so do not think for a moment that a Reform government would not be able to run the economy, or that there would be a run on the banks as there was, say, under Liz Truss. And let's put that in context, because she had policies which in many respects are quite close to those of Nigel Farage, that she wanted to aim for the Thatcherite solution, which is small government, low taxes, lots of freedom, let people say what they want, you know, none of this controls over freedom of speech. And she was thrown off by a spike in bond yields, of all things.
Yeah.
Now, I just wish she'd rung me, because I'd have said, look, don't give in. That spike will stop and it'll go back the other way. And in fact, it did exactly that. But then, the moment she'd gone, it spiked even higher, and it has stayed much higher.
High now.
And it's high now, because the real problem never was Liz Truss and her policies. It was, in fact, that Britain is bankrupt because the state has overextended itself. And the biggest task that a Farage government faces is to get the economy back under control. And that's not going to be easy because of the Blair constitutional reforms. Effectively, Blair tore up 1,000 years of the Constitution. If you haven't had David Starkey on, you must get him on, because he's best of all on this.
We've had him.
You've had him. Well,
he instructed me to read 2 books.
He's a great one for doing that.
Yeah, well, I said at the end of the interview, I'm not surprised you two are friends. So it was Edmund Burke's Reflections on the Revolution in France.
Oh, that's a most important book.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
And
yes,
and he
was very far-sighted, was Edmund Burke.
Yeah, and was it The Origins of English Individualism or British Individualism?
Oh, that one I haven't come across.
Yeah,
interesting.
So I've read both of those, but I mentioned I've got a book I would recommend, but I'm reading Hayek's The Fatal Conceit, but alongside that I'm also reading a book by Jane Jacobs called The Death and Life of Great American Cities. It's very...
Oh, that's a more granular thing, yes.
But it's very Hayek in its thinking, in that it's the same criticism of planning for cities. The top-down planning for cities is what destroys cities. It is the spontaneous actions of individuals that creates a city, and we should not interfere with that. It's very Hayek in its...
I think this is absolutely right. See, again, right at the heart of this is that the economic libertarian, the Hayeks of this world and the Friedmans and all of those, they trust the individual person. Because, again, it goes back to love. The individual can be trusted because those who have the imagination to invent something, to create a business, to develop a new product, Those are the movers and shakers on which the world is founded. That's what makes things grow. And you have to give them the space and the freedom and the financial rewards if they do it. And if you take all that away by crushing them, then you get nothing. And indeed, there's a very good example of this. If we look at Islam again, how many Nobel Prize winners has this country produced?
So on this podcast, you are definitely hearing me talk about Bitcoin a lot. Well, why? We live in a really strange time with governments driving inflation with their reckless spending and endless money printing. There is a way out of this. There is a way to protect your money, and that is by stacking Bitcoin. I've made loads of shows about Bitcoin. You can go and research this, you can go and read the books, but the truth is it is the hardest money ever created. If you are interested in protecting your financial future, it's time for you to get on the Bitcoin train. I've been stacking Bitcoin personally and through my businesses since 2017. It's protected me, it's secured my family's future, and it also strengthens all of my businesses. So if you want to start stacking Bitcoin, where do you do it? Well, for me, it's with Gemini. They're a fully licensed, full reserve exchange and custodian, so they give you a secure way for you to buy and own your Bitcoin. There's no risks and no funny business. So if you're serious about stacking Bitcoin the right way, head over to Gemini.com, which is GEMINI.com.
It's about 85.
I was about to say 100. So.
Yeah.
But that was just a random
There
guess.
or thereby. That's absolutely right. It's more than any other country by a country mile. Why? Because until communism came along, we had a regime that was uniquely favourable to invention, discovery, and enquiry. It's not like the universities now, which are all thanatist. They're all communist. They're all shutting down debate. I went to this climate conference in Paris last week. A lot of them were from British universities. They were all communists. One of them was even wearing a T-shirt saying, it had a EU, logo on it, and the words "Cambridge stays." When the rest of Britain left the EU, Cambridge stays. So I said, "Oh, you're not much of a fan of democracy then?" And his feeble reply was, "Well, I'm entitled to my opinion." I said, "Yes, you are, mate, and you're jolly lucky to, because in the EU you wouldn't be."
Yeah, ironically.
Yes. So it's very interesting how the whole of the free market economic system, which is basically not taught in the universities. And there's a very revealing moment when Charlie Kirk, who's a wonderful guy at Turning Point USA, who goes onto campuses, sets up his tent, literally, and then people can come and argue with him.
I know what you're going to tell me.
And
I've seen it.
You saw the cut of the guy who was asked what economics books he was reading.
Yeah, have you read Rothbard? Have you read Hayek? Have you read Friedman?
He didn't know who any of them were.
No, he didn't. Well, so I did economics at A-level at school.
Yeah.
We were taught Keynesian economics.
Yeah.
I didn't discover Austrian economics until I discovered Bitcoin. When I discovered Bitcoin,
Fascinating.
I discovered Austrian economics.
Fascinating.
And it's only at this stage of my life, that I've been going down that rabbit hole and reading, and my poor children get almost daily a preaching from me of free markets and small government, and why we shouldn't let the communists win.
Well, the thing is, communism is a religion of hate.
Yes.
The worst of all, actually. I mean,
it sells itself on love.
But not really. When you look at the consequences, the number of, the hundreds of thousands, between, what did we say, 100 and...
Over 100 million.
130 to 250
Mao
million.
was a large percentage of those.
Well, but you look at Stalin and Lenin, for that matter, and now you've got Putin doing his best.
Yeah.
You've got Kim Jong-un, you've got Pol Pot, you've got all these horrendous creatures.
Yeah.
And now you've got Stalin. I mean, look at the number of people that are... just take the number of babies that were killed last year.
255,000, I think it was.
Certainly over 200,000.
Yeah.
And if you look at... There was a huge debate when the Office for National Statistics decided it would tell us that we were only breeding 1.5 babies per... I suppose we now have to call them a potentially pregnant person of childbearing age. I think that's the new gabble for it. What you and I might have called a lady, but no, you're not allowed to use those words.
I'll use that word.
And there was a huge debate about how we were no longer replacing our indigenous population. Not one report that I saw, and I try to read quite widely, mentioned that if we hadn't killed 200,000 babies, then our births would have been exactly at replacement rate.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, no, you're right.
And we are literally killing our own population. And I gave a talk to the Gloucester Conservatives. And you'd thought, Gloucester was kind of instinctually conservative. And I was about 10 minutes into my talk, and I said, I'm going to mention the dreaded word abortion, not from the moral point of view, you either get that or you don't, but from the economic point of view. And I gave them those figures. And then there were various shrieking women who interrupted, and they said, you've used the word abortion, we don't want to hear you anymore. And I had to stop speaking.
Communists.
And that's in a conservative, nominally anyway, conservative association. That's how far the country has gone from where it was under Margaret Thatcher.
Well, this is what Hayek said. He said first they will come for your money. Once they've got control of your money, then they'll come for your speech and your thoughts and your ideas. And this is exactly where we are now.
Then they'll come for you and they will kill you.
Yes.
That's what thanatism is. All these totalitarian movements, doesn't matter whether they are called left or right, if they are extremist and they are pushing a narrow, hostile agenda, mass death is always the result. We see it now. Our little children are being killed on a horrifying scale.
Well, I want to ask you more about that because that's going to the Lords.
Yeah.
So you will get to debate that. But I was going to ask you, I mean, you've already talked highly of Nigel Farage, but I find I romanticize about being a child and watching Prime Minister's Question Time under Thatcher, and we seem to have characters and people with a backbone who would stand up and debate ideas with integrity.
That's right.
I now look at Westminster and I see very few people I rate. I'm quite a fan of Nick Timothy. I thought he did a good job on free speech recently.
Very good. He's been speaking out excellently on that.
I like Zia Youssef, but he's not an MP. I do like Nigel. I'm quite fond of Katie Lamb as well, the Conservatives. I think she's interesting. But generally, I see a room that looks like a local council. A very low quality. And I'm just wondering, who impresses you?
You asked absolutely the right question, because there's been an appalling decline. And I can tell you a little bit about how it happened. Because about 20 years ago, at the instigation of the Disinformation Directorate of the KGB, the Conservative Party was manoeuvred into ending the selection of candidates at constituency level. That was the great strength of the Conservative Party. I remember when I was at Cambridge and we used to get every week there'd be a new MP coming down to speak to us. Everybody from Geoffrey Archer in one direction to Rhodes Boyce in another, who was the equivalent of Catherine Birbal Singh in his day. He ran a disciplined school and was getting stellar results just as she does. And these were all men and women who, in their various fields, knew what they were doing and then went into Parliament because they wanted to serve, not because that was the only way they could get that kind of money and that kind of status. And they were chosen locally. I was invited to be the MP for Maidstone, both by the previous MP when he was retiring and then by the constituency. And I had to say no because I wasn't well at the time. I couldn't do justice to it. So Anne Widdecombe got it instead.
We've had her here. She's fantastic.
But of course she is. We're a good lot down in Kent. But she, she's done a very good job. But she was chosen by the local constituency. She'd never been chosen by some fancy pants at central office. But when they'd been persuaded to centralise the selection of candidates, and the excuse was used that, of course, occasionally you'd get a wrong un who was selected, who might then have had a skeleton in his cupboard that they should have found out about or whatever. That was the excuse for the centralisation, which was an entirely unjustifiable, insufficient excuse, but it was enough for the bureaucrats to grab control. Then, two agents of influence who, if they weren't actually working for the Kremlin, they might as well have been, let's just put it no stronger than that, got in to the candidate selection machine at central office, now Conservative headquarters, and anyone who was any good was automatic. Didn't matter what their politics were. They didn't choose them. Anyone who was any good was automatically not allowed to become an MP. Most notoriously, David Frost. I don't know whether you've met David.
I haven't. I would
He's
love
a
to.
lovely man. You must get him on
Yeah.
too, because he writes wonderful columns for the Telegraph. Now, he was the senior civil servant, and there are some good ones. Not as many as one would wish, but there are some good ones. And the one good thing Boris did in an otherwise chaotic administration was he put David Frost in charge of doing the negotiations with the EU to try and recover the disastrous position that Theresa May had left behind, because she really was totally incompetent. And I knew her when she was at Oxford and I was at Cambridge. And even then, she was a figure in the Oxford Union, but everything she touched sort of turned to poop. She was utterly incompetent. And she made a real mess of the Brexit thing. And David Frost, therefore, not only had to negotiate with a bitterly hostile EU, which wanted to punish Britain, not so much because it hated Britain, as because it didn't want other countries doing what Britain had done, so it wanted to make it difficult for them, and it wanted to make them see that it would be difficult for them. That's why the EU was so difficult with us. So all of these difficulties that David Frost was confronted with, and he still managed to get us Brexit. And that was an astonishing achievement. So he then put himself forward, very much with my encouragement, among others, as a Conservative MP. And there was a constituency that very badly wanted him. No names, no pack drill. And I arranged funding for him from a mate of mine who was rich and was willing to help. So all in place. And then when he put in his application, these hideous creatures at Central Office rejected him without explanation. But I know what the reason was. It was because he was good at what he was doing. And they didn't want that. And so after 20 years of relentlessly weeding out anyone who was any good as a candidate, these two people at Central Office have got away with this all that time. They're still there.
Is this CCHQ, is it called?
They now call Conservative headquarters. That's right. They used to be the Conservative Central Office. They've changed their name recently. But these people have been there for 20 years, and that's what they've done. They've just... Now, all you've got on the Conservative bench is dross.
Yeah.
That's why. You see, the great range of characters that you got from all different backgrounds, some of them military, some of them educational, some of them business, that you got when the local constituency chose somebody it liked, not necessarily from its own territory. They might choose somebody who they saw more of a national figure and they wanted to lift the profile of their association in the Conservative movement, whatever. You got a really good mixture of people being chosen. And the most fatal thing they did was to allow themselves to be manoeuvred by Putin's people into centralizing it. And then these two agents of influence came in and just kept out all the good people. It's such a simple way of taking over what had been until then far and away the most successful political party in all of Europe.
And now it's dying.
That's all it took. And that's exactly the kind of thing the Disinformation Directorate was so good at. Because I used to know the guy who came out to the West in 1978, Ion Mihai Pacepa, and he told us everything about how they worked. And they were really good at this kind of psychological manoeuvring. They were brilliant at it. And so that's what destroyed the Conservative Party. And if, Kemi Badenoch happens to be listening in, you need to kick out everyone who is in that office and allow the constituencies to choose their own people once again. And then and only then will you start to rebuild the Conservative Party, and it'll take 20 years to undo the damage that these two people have done.
Yeah, I mean, if she even survives, I watched an interview with Dominic Cummings recently. He thinks she's gone by the end of the year. I suspect she may be, but they're not fixing the root problem of the party.
Well, until they do that, nothing else is going to work, because the people who are in the Conservative Party now are almost entirely 14th rate. As a deliberate matter of policy, that's how it was done.
But why? I don't understand why. Is this just
because
control?
If you want to destroy the British economy, you want to destroy the British society, then you have to destroy the Conservative Party. And eventually the Russians realised that that's what they should do. That's how they did it. It's really simple.
Can you bring that back up, Connor? This is quite interesting.
So this is a projection. If we were to have an election tomorrow, what the seats would be.
So Reform would win, but it would be a hung parliament. They wouldn't have the...
They're just short. Even with the Conservatives, they'd be short by about 7 seats.
But that's now, I say give it 3 years. The momentum is huge.
I think that's it, provided they can keep going. and provided they've now got a proper policy unit. And that's another thing. I had a mate who had some money and he said, I want to help. So I pointed him in the direction of the policy outfit, and he's given them some funding to get that going. That's beginning to pay dividends now, because Nigel is now beginning to get into policy areas that really weren't his own before, because he's got backup from his own team in a way that he's never had before. I regard that as very important. And, the great thing is that he's, like any bloke down the pub, he's sensible. Yeah, he's down to it, he's planted. This is the great thing about Nigel. And, I wouldn't put him in charge of a whelk stall because he's not good at man management, but he's very, very good at the qualities that you need to be a political leader. He speaks the language of the people. Frankly, virtually nobody in the Conservative Party now does that. He comes across as somebody that you would be happy to meet and have some fun with down the pub. You wouldn't be frightened of him. You'd enjoy his company. That's why people are going to vote for him.
And the speed of which they've grown is, I find it staggering.
Well, this is really down to the very small, desperately overworked team at Reform headquarters. And I'm still quite worried about that, and I'm going to try and point somebody towards them to get them some more money to run that site. They need more bods in there. They've got a very good new treasurer now, because the old one wasn't as hardworking as they would have liked. They've got a new chairman. We'll see how he works out. The old chairman, I think, had just worked way, way too hard, but that's how it was done. They got into all these local council areas. They went right down to the grassroots. They built organisations in all these different council areas. I mean, it was an astonishing logistical achievement. And, really all credit to them. That they had done that fast gives me great hope that, and I'm going to say when rather than if, they win the next election, they will act that fast to restore our country too. I think that they can do it.
Is there anybody left in the Conservative Party that impresses you?
Well, it's very, very difficult now, because they, even the ones I like, they're not kind of doing anything about it. And they've kind of frozen, like rabbits. You've ever seen a rabbit in the headlights? They don't know where to go. And that's how they all are at the moment. And so I don't see, a great leader emerging from there. And I think, frankly, a lot of them will keep their heads down and leave Kemi there. That's why I think she's safe, because none of them will want the job. They don't think...
I think Jenrick wants the job.
I'm not sure he still will when he sees the way the polls are going.
Right.
They have really finished themselves. This policy of getting rid of all the good people and replacing them with dross has it's had the obvious effect. It's had the intended effect. It's destroyed the party. Rebuilding that would take so long that nobody really wants to be leader during those grinding 20 years until you've got good people back in the house again. So no, I don't see her being supplanted. I think she'll survive, not because she's any good, because I don't rate her very highly, but simply because nobody else really wants the job now. I think Jenrick might have wanted it at the outset, and perhaps would have made a better fist of it, who can tell, if he'd got it. But the real trouble is that now, I wouldn't want it, would you?
Well, I mean, they're facing obliteration in the next election.
And I don't see that as being reversible. You'd need somebody of the same kind of calibre as Nigel Farage. And they don't grow on trees, frankly.
No, and I think if Conservatives, I think if Reform win and Nigel delivers for the country, and is bold and brave and pulls apart that horrific deep state civil service and reduces taxation and delivers back for the country, I don't see a role for the Conservatives anymore.
But here's the difficulty that he's going to face, and we must be very realistic about the problems that he's going to face. And getting control of the machinery of government is not going to be easy. See, in Margaret Thatcher's day, even then, the conversations during the years running up to her victory, because I used to work regularly at the Centre for Policy Studies, I used to take the minutes of the meetings of the great and the good when they came and discussed what eventually shaped Thatcherism. And even then, the big concern was that the civil service were instinctually totalitarian. They didn't want the Conservatives to win. They wouldn't want to implement our policies. How were we going to make this work? Now, that problem has been made 100 times worse by the Blair constitutional reforms, which effectively have taken away from ministers the power to run their departments.
Can it not just be taken back?
How do you do that?
I don't know, yeah.
Well, here's the problem. You come into office in order to make the really radical changes to things like immigration policy that you're going to have to make, and where you're going to have the whole civil service, the whole establishment is going to be against you. All the courts are against you because they've now been captured as well, and they've been wokeized. You know, the judges are absolutely ghastly these days. The change since I used to have much to do with the court is horrendous. They've been completely captured by, effectively, a communist, totalitarian outlook. The court system has been restructured. The Judicial Committee of the House of Lords has gone, been replaced by the so-called Supreme so-called Court, which is effectively a sort of Soviet arrangement. And it looks very much with communist eyes at everything. I mean, it's quite terrifying. So how are you going to capture it, given that the communist Supreme Court will work tirelessly day and night against you, just as it did against Boris Johnson, wouldn't let him prorogue Parliament. Actually, it went against the Queen for the first time. A court said, no, the Queen can't exercise her power to prorogue Parliament. It's an extraordinary thing to do. But that's how supreme they now see themselves to be. And they will do their damnedest to stop a Farage government from succeeding. So let us look at this from a business-like point of view. How would one take power the moment that majority is achieved and neutralize these enormously powerful entities, the civil service and the courts, which will be implacably against you, as will the now wokeized city, because they too have been largely captured. And they too will not want a Farage government. They'll be frightened of it to some extent because they don't quite know whether he'll be able to get the thing onto an even keel economically. To some extent, that fear is legitimate. He hasn't yet said enough about economic policy for them to quite know how that's going to work out. And so you can understand their nervousness to some extent there. But that is being worked on. So I think he'll sort that out in good time. But the real problem is you're going to need to get a capture bill of some sort through very quickly. And, of course, the parliamentary timetable can be slow, though it can be accelerated in emergency. I think we are now in an emergency. And although I think I should hesitate to go down the route of using the Emergency Powers Act, which means that a minister can literally just start issuing orders saying, I'm doing it under the Emergency Powers Act, and then everybody has to jump into line and Parliament eventually gets to scrutinise it later. I wouldn't favour that route because it's kind of against everything that Nigel is and stands for. You're saying, right, we want democracy, so we're going to impose it on you whether you like it or not. And that it kind of doesn't, you can see it doesn't work that from the political point of view. So I think what I would do is I would try to get a bill through, which would have to be particularly comprehensive. It'll have to be effectively drafted long before they get into office. And that bill would then have to be got through the Commons. Well, if you've got a majority in the Commons, you can do that. But then, here's the problem. The Lords. There are no reform peers. Now, they're entitled to, well, if they were on parity with the Conservatives, 200. If they're on parity with the other parties, certainly 100 peers. But here again, you get Nigel. I suspect that his attitude to this would be, well, I don't really want there to be a Lords at all. I don't want to sort of get into that because it is alien to my bloke down the pub approach to things. But the trouble is, until the Lords has been got rid of, and that requires primary legislation, it has power over legislation, and it can, at the very least, slow you down fatally, unless you can at least have your quota of peers in the Lords well before the election, so they've learnt how the system works and can make sure they helped get legislation through in the Lords, because otherwise you're stymied. You see, it was all right for the Conservatives under Margaret Thatcher because we still had the hereditaries in, And therefore there was an inbuilt majority for conservatism, though it was very careful to still let Labour legislation through when Labour won. But Labour will not be so delicate the other direction. If Reform wins, the Labour, the Lib Dems, the Greens, the Bishops, they will all be against Reform. They will try to derail anything that Reform tries to do.
How does the laws shape change in an election, or does it not?
It doesn't, basically.
It just doesn't.
No, the only way it changes is by appointment. You see, it's not elected. And this is where I think Nigel could square that circle. I think what he should do is to come out and say, right, in 1999, when all the chinless hereditaries, like my dad, for instance, were thrown out. So, I've never sat in the Lords because I'm just another chinless hereditary, but I do have a chin. It's now entirely an appointed house. And so they're all placemen. And they're pretty third rate, actually. That's why if Reform were to put in, as it's entitled to do, certainly 100, maybe 200 peers, and start now, then they could choose people who know how to run a railway, know how to make things work, and can learn very quickly the procedures in the House of Lords, so that at least there'll be a couple of hundred Reform peers to stand up and argue for a Reform bill, because there's nobody in the Lords at all to argue for Reform bills at the moment. They haven't thought this through. And so it's something I'm going to try to get on their agenda, because they've got so much to do in order to turn round the catastrophic mess that's been left behind by this now dead from the neck up and the neck down Conservative Party and the still unfortunately vicious and wicked Labour Party. And so much damage has been done by those two. So much needs to be changed. But so inbuilt is the resistance to that change in the establishment, and in particular in the Lords, that getting the necessary legislation through fast is going to be really, really difficult. And that is it seems to be a long way down the road, doesn't it? 3 or 4 years yet. But it takes an awful lot of preparation to get your hands on that one and get it sorted out. And so one of the things I am sort of trying to get on Reform's agenda is you need to deal with this. You need to get your bods in there. Because, among other things, they're going to be they are already very carefully selecting pretty good people to be parliamentary candidates at the next election. They're working very hard on choosing people of quality and who know how to run things, and they achieved things in their lives, and therefore they've got something to contribute, not just the dross the Conservatives have been shipping in. But still, the whims of the electorate are such that you may have a person that you particularly wanted to, for instance, shut down all the nut zero nonsense, and they don't happen to get in at that particular constituency. But if you've got somebody in the Lords backing each of the various cabinet posts you might want to retain, then you can always make that Lord a cabinet minister. And it's already taken care of.
Okay.
They haven't thought this through yet. That's what they need to be doing. And these are sort of very pragmatic, sort of down-to-earth, rather boring tasks. And bless them, they're so overworked at Reform HQ that what I think they now need is they need more funding, and they need probably 1 or 2 people of my kind of background just to tell them how the machinery of government works, what they need to do in order to capture it and make sure that they control it in a manner where it does respond favourably to what they're trying to do.
Yeah. We should talk about net zero,
yes.
climate change, because I know this is a very important topic for you. And just to give you some context, so I'm a child of the 80s.
Yes.
I remember the ozone. I remember CFCs. I've lived through it all. And I just lived with this belief that humans were causing the climate to change, and this would ultimately be catastrophic. More recently, I'm trying to separate that from net zero. I'm trying to understand, one, the science, and then separately, what we need to do as an economy for our energy, the energy mix and energy prices. And I'm fully against net zero. Even if we are facing a catastrophic climate situation, there is no incentive to do anything when we are, 1% of global emissions?
0.8.
0.8.
Yeah.
It's insanity. our energy prices are too high. As a business owner, I see it.
Well, of course, our business energy prices are the highest in the world, bar none.
It's
And
ridiculous.
according to a recent report by the Confederation of British Industry, which is at last beginning to find its voice again, this is solely because of the useless Miliband and his net zero policies.
Yeah, I mean, he's about the worst. I mean, him and Rachel Reeves are competing for two of the worst politicians to ever exist in this country.
He's 14th rate. His brother is much brighter and more dangerous, but Ed Miliband is dangerous simply because he's such a fool. And it's a great shame. Can we bring your lad in on this?
Yes.
Because I'd like to know what his view is on the climate question.
Oh God.
Go on.
We had a chap in Rupert Reed quite recently. He's very pro climate change. I wouldn't say so much net zero,
Yeah, no, he thinks it's important.
but not to the rapid rate we're seeing.
No.
There's an importance there in conserving what we have for the future. I don't think it's worth the rate at which we're doing it, risking what we have now.
Your son does you great credit.
Yes.
There is a balanced view.
Yes.
Now, what I'm going to do is to give you a few killer facts to play with. First of all, in policy terms, as a former policy wonk working with Margaret Thatcher, you start by trying to find out what the right question is. And the right question is this. It's not how much global warming might we cause, but rather, in policy terms, how much of the global warming that we might otherwise cause could we prevent or abate, to use the economic term, by the UN's target year of 2050 for net zero worldwide, if all the countries of the world, and not just 10% of the world, mainly Western countries, were all to move in a straight line from their current sins of emission to net zero by 2050. What is the answer to that question? When I was at this climate conference of mainly communist economists making a fortune out of this climate scam last week, there was a guy who stood up and made the opening keynote speech, went on for an hour with what I call a wank model, rubbish in and rubbish out, spewing all over the place purposelessly. And so you're going to have to edit this, aren't you?
No. That's probably going to be the highlight.
And so I always sit at the front when you're on a hostile audience, and then you can stick your hand up and they can't in the end avoid letting you ask a question. So I said, why haven't you asked the anterior question? You have to use words like anterior in an academic setting because they don't understand it, basically. And so I said, you have to ask this earlier question, don't you, before you start playing with your wank model. You have to ask, first of all, even if the whole world went to net zero, would it make any difference to the climate? And the answer, nobody, until the Strategic Threat Assessment Group, which I do things with, had sat down and worked this out. And it turns out to be a very easy calculation using their numbers. This is the great technique I learned from studying Aristotle. Always use the other side's facts and figures as often as you can, because it gives them less to argue about. If you use their numbers and you work it out, then the amount of global warming that the whole world would forestall, if the whole world, rather than just 10% of it, went in a straight line to net zero by 2050, is, Connor Jr., give us the answer. Guess.
What is the, if every country in the world went to net zero?
In a straight line from their current emissions by 2050, by how much would the planet be cooler by 2050 than if we carried on as we are? Roughly.
0.1.
0.1 is the right answer.
Poor lad.
0.1 Celsius degrees.
Okay,
That is all.
so we can only stop 0.1.
The climate wouldn't notice. You'd have to go to 2100, and then you might be able to get it down by another 0.9,
Okay.
because it only really begins to work once you... But then the trouble is, there's the cost.
Yes.
And the only reliable cost figure that I'm able to find was done a few years ago by the grid authority here. And it said that just to net zeroise the UK national grid would take, let me see, what did they say? They said it would cost $3.8 trillion.
Okay, we don't have that much.
That's 1/4 of UK emissions. So make that $15.2 trillion just to net zeroise the UK grid. Now, put that in pounds, it's about £12 trillion. But if you did this globally and you extrapolated that cost estimate globally, and that's a realistic figure, then you're looking at $2 quadrillion. And to put that in terms that folk could understand, that would be the equivalent of 20 years total GDP globally.
Yes.
Total GDP globally. That is how silly this is. That is how little the spending, and so if you then take it down into numbers that folk might be able to kind of grasp, every $1 billion that you spent on trying to make global warming go away between here and 2050 would reduce global temperature by 2050 by 1/20 millionth of a Celsius degree. $1 billion spent, 1/20 millionth of a Celsius degree abated. That is how small it is.
So is this just a big grift?
Yeah, exactly that.
It's
There's
just
some
another
people
one.
making money.
It's a lot of people making money, and a lot of people, the taxpayers and the energy users, being bankrupted as a result. And the businesses in this country that have had to get out, anyone with any get up and go has got up and gone already, and they're still going.
Well, go on.
Can I just go? I keep coming back to this thing where it speaks to so many people about various different issues.
Yeah.
People make it sound so simple, so clear.
Yeah.
How are they getting away with it?
It's very important that you don't lose this, okay? This is your inheritance through Bitcoin.
Let Bitcoin rip. Don't rip up your Bitcoin. Set up inheritance with Casa.
They're getting away with it because the media are allowed to take the Communist Party line on this and never to allow the other side to be heard. All debate on this has been shut down in the main news media in this country because the Office for Communism, which is the regulator that's supposed to guarantee balance in news programs, has issued a public statement to the effect that you're allowed to give only the Communist Party line on the climate question, and they don't ever have to have the likes of me on the BBC or the ITV or Sky TV or Channel 4. They are not obliged to give the other side of the story on this. It's the only subject where they've ever done this before. They've shut down all debate. And so in Britain, that's why we're so extremely, besotted with this climate nonsense, because the other side is never heard. But it gets better than this, because the whole climate nonsense is based on an elementary error of physics, first perpetrated by a communist at NASA in 1984, an appropriately chosen
Ironic.
year, you may think. Yes. Have you read 1984? You should read that.
Yeah, or at least watch the film.
It'll give you read the book. It's short. It'll
Yeah.
give you a very good idea of why thanatist cults end up killing people. It's a brilliant book by
It's Orwell.
George Orwell.
You've read Animal Farm, right? Yeah.
Yeah, well, 1984 is even better than Animal Farm, and you should really go for that. So they made this catastrophic mistake. You know what they did? They forgot the sun was shining. And it's kind of a fairly big mistake to make when you're dealing with the climate, because nearly all the heat that comes into our climate doesn't come from CO2, the control knob of the climate, as they call it. It actually comes from the sunshine. And what they did was they borrowed from a really difficult and counterintuitive branch of electronic engineering physics called control theory. Have you even heard of control theory? No. Nobody in here except me has even heard of control theory. It's what makes a steam engine not over-rev and blow itself up. You have a thing called a governor. And you ever seen the old steam engines?
Yeah.
They have these balls on a kind of grasshopper legs, and as that spins faster and faster, the balls go out, and therefore it spins slower again. That's a feedback mechanism. It's reacting to the thing over-revving and slowing it down again.
Do you know what, Kurt? Do you know what that also reminds me of? It's the difficulty adjustment in Bitcoin.
Yeah,
Exactly the same.
It's the difficulty adjustment in Bitcoin.
Same thing there. That's
Yeah.
also a feedback mechanism.
Yeah.
And there are, in fact, universal laws of feedback. They originally worked out for electronic circuits so that they could make telephones work without amplifying the noise as well as the signal. That's what they were originally invented for, by a wonderful guy called Harold S. Black at Bell Labs in New York in the 1920s and 30s. And he couldn't get a patent for it on either side of the Atlantic originally because they just said, no, this is just a short circuit. It couldn't possibly work. And so right at the outset, this is difficult mathematics. And the only reason why I understand it is that I was trained at Cambridge in classical mathematics, which has some extremely powerful techniques that are largely unknown in physics today, but which turn out to have applicability to physics. And one of these is that the person who invented calculus was not Newton, it was not Leibniz, it was Archimedes. And in his pre-calculus phase, he wanted to find the area subtended by a random second line of the parabola. Have I lost you? I do hope so.
A little bit.
Yes, good. Well, anyway, he wanted to find this area, a shape, geometric shape.
Yeah.
And in order to do it, he found that by dividing it up into a series of triangles, each group of triangles had an area 1/4 of the previous group, and you could fill the entire rather weird shape by this technique. And that gave you what is known as the closed form sum of an infinite Archimedean geometric progression of powers of 1/4. And that turns out, funnily enough, to be of direct relevance to how feedback loops work.
Okay.
Once you understand that, the most important conclusion you learn from that is that you cannot leave out what's called the input signal to the temperature feedback amplifier circuit.
Okay.
And it works just the same as an electronic circuit. The mathematics is precisely the same for all dynamical systems. There's systems that change their state over time. Now, no climate scientist knows a word of what I've just told you. It would all be complete gobbledygook to them. They do not understand how feedback mechanisms work. But my team does. And so we have recently published a short abstract of our result, and we're now grinding through the review process to get one of the major climate journals on the other side of the debate to publish the full paper. It's still very short, it's only 3,000 words. Once that paper is published, that is the end of the climate nonsense, because the only reason they thought there'd be a lot of warming rather than just a little is they screwed up. They didn't realize that you had to include the fact that the sun is shining as the input to the temperature feedback circuit.
Incredible.
Once you include that, then the feedback intensity, which is the originating feedback variable in the climate, becomes very tiny. And then you can no longer use feedback analysis at all to try to predict global warming, because the climate is actually hypersensitive to very small changes over time variance, as we call it in mathematics, of feedback intensity. So you can't use the principal mechanism they use at the moment to try to predict how much global warming there will be, because the climate is much more sensitive to it than they think. And yet, there's been hardly any change in global temperature over the last 150 years. It's been just over 1 Celsius. And of that, only a tiny fraction is feedback response, not as they thought, 3 or 4 times the direct warming by our greenhouse gases. So they just screwed up.
Wow.
And once that comes out, and they've been trying to suppress it for years, but we've now got it to the point where they basically can't argue anymore, that's the end of the climate debate. The whole thing is nonsense.
It's the it's become my secondary argument for why I think we should have small government.
Yeah.
In that, firstly, I just believe in free markets. I believe I'm a better investor than the government, and actually, I'm being disincentivized to invest at the moment because they've taken out all the benefits of running a company. They've made it super hard.
Exactly.
So I believe in free markets because I believe in the individual. But my second,
Because you love your fellow man. Put it that way.
yeah,
Don't be coy about it. Don't be
That's
frightened
fine.
to say that you love your fellow man, because that's what a libertarian is. He is somebody who is able to put his trust and his affection in his fellow countrymen, and he can rely upon their basic common sense to do the right thing and make stuff work.
But
you see how attractive it is if you put it not just, it's a kind of ruthless economic red in tooth and claw, everybody fights and somebody wins. If you put it the other way around, saying we trust each other enough that we can have this glorious chaos of the free market. It's not run by some central agency, and there a single mistake screws it all up. There you'll get lots of mistakes, but they're smaller ones.
Yes.
And the market absorbs them,
Yes.
and it grows, and it's free, and it goes places. You see, it's a wonderful thing, the free market, because it is an expression of that love which the Lord of life wished us to express.
But my second argument for it as well is the bigger the machinery of government becomes, the more opportunities there are for vultures to grift from it. So we've seen this a lot locally.
Absolutely right.
Care homes. Recently just found out about a landlord where I live in Bedford. He used to buy houses, renovate them and rent them out.
Yeah.
Good business. He's making so much money off renting properties to the local council.
Yeah.
He doesn't even buy properties now. He rents them and then sublets them to the council at a higher rate.
Yeah.
And we're questioning, is this happening because he's got a friend in there who's giving him the better rates, or is it just because the council is so poor at procurement? But we talked about the mobility scheme, but government has just become a big machine where vultures can go in and grift things from it. And the climate, this is the problem with the climate. But like someone like Dale Vince, who I think is a communist himself, he'll probably sue me now for saying that. But he, he has a large energy company, which is an eco-friendly energy company, and he very much benefits from the green movement, and he's also a Labour Party donor. Yeah. To me, everywhere I look, I mean, this is one of the things you've spotted a lot, isn't it, Connor? Connor's biggest complaint is, I go to work, I pay tax, and he works hard. I make him work hard. He works weekends, he puts the hours in, and he said, I'm playing the game. You say it, Con.
You just
go on.
you're halfway through it.
Yeah, but it's better to hear it from you.
It feels completely unfair to play the game fairly and not reap the benefits that maybe you're seeing elsewhere.
That, in a nutshell,
It's a broken game.
Beautifully put. He's always right, isn't he? I mean, you've done well with
the preaching.
No, fantastic. That's absolutely right. One of the bitterest regrets I have is that what we put in place under the Thatcher government did not long survive it, because there were so many vested interests, the ones you were just talking about, who suddenly couldn't help themselves at the taxpayers' expense anymore, and they really wanted to once again. And you're quite right, this climate thing is all part of that. But the net effect of all these creeps coming in and grabbing fortunes off the government, it's not off the government, because it's not the government's money, it's your money, Connor. And that's what's happening. It's robbery, organised robbery by the governing elite against people like you who do not have the opportunities that I had when I was a lad, because thanks to the Thatcher government, I could afford just to buy a house. I bought a tiny house in a very smart street in Richmond. It was literally only 11 feet by 21, 2 stories plus an attic. And I filled it with lodgers from the local Catholic college so that I could pay the mortgage, which was enormous in those days, because the interest rates were very high. I mean, I had to pay, I think, 15%. No, it's 25% I had to pay in my first year. Really, 25% of the entire value of the house just in interest.
Wow.
So I filled it with lodgers. We had people.
But what was the value of the house?
The value of the house was, at that time, I paid £37,000
That house in Richmond.
for this tiny house in Richmond. Now you'd be looking at 1.3 million.
Yeah.
So, that's because if you have unbridled mass immigration, then the demand for housing goes up, and the law of supply and demand is not up for repeal any time Soon, if you've got a more or less fixed number of houses, but a vastly increasing number of people wanting the houses, the price of houses goes up. So immigration, this is the thing I have out with Nigel often. I say, look, mate, why do you not sell the immigration point by saying that the young people of this country can't afford to buy a house because mass immigration has forced up the price to put it completely beyond their reach? That's the argument. It's not just the racialist argument that they've got different coloured skins or different coloured religion. The real problem is that there are just so many of them, doesn't matter where they come from or what they think or believe, that it's distorting our economy in a way that it wasn't designed to handle. House prices are only one example of that. Another, of course, is the poor old NHS. Now, I'm only alive thanks to the NHS, bless their little cotton socks. And so when I see the NHS is being said to be dysfunctional, no, it ain't. It's just grossly overloaded by people. Because we had planned for an orderly growth in population when I was at 10 Downing Street, because we had a Prime Minister who had made it very clear to people who wanted to come in illegally that they'd better not, or they'd have a very uncomfortable time of it, so they stopped coming. But after her time, it got worse and worse and worse. And then Boris, who was a complete nincompoop, opened the floodgates. And so now, you, Connor, young Connor, you are now suffering the consequence of that, because mass immigration has forced up the price of housing. And it means if you want to get, you haven't got piles yet, but when you do, you won't be able to get them done on the NHS because the queues will be too long. Because, of course, it's the immigrants who get priority over the rest of us.
Well, I think those messages are resonating. I also, on the house, I agree with you on the housing, but I also think by destroying the money itself, we've made the house an asset. I remember my dad used to save money in the bank.
Yeah.
He used to get a decent interest rate. The interest was above inflation. We've destroyed the money, so people bought houses as their assets, as their retirement
Actually,
funds.
you can still get interest above inflation if you simply put the money in the stock market. It's very interesting. I did this I should have done it much earlier. In fact, one of the policies I'm hoping Reform might want to pick up is that if we need to encourage more children.
Yes.
So I would say that for every child that's born in this country, the state should put £7,000 at birth into a savings account, just an ordinary stock market pension type savings account, reasonably cautious, and then leave it there until whatever the retirement age shall be.
I would put it into Bitcoin.
You would, except that is a Ponzi scheme at root.
No,
and in the end, there comes a problem with it. And I've got a better model for a private currency, because I talked to Hayek about this. It's one of his big things was private currency. And the trouble with Bitcoin is it is essentially a Ponzi scheme. It works on scarcity, and that forces the price up, and that's very nice if you've got in early. Congratulations.
Well, isn't that the same as gold?
Up to a point, Lord Copper. It's not even as substantial as gold. What I would do is to have a fully fungible savings account currency. Let's call it the talent. And the way that would work is that it would be backed by real assets, which would be managed by professional fund managers. And so your talents would be, you could use your credit card to spend and save, etc., in talents, but the talent would appreciate along with the stock market approximately. So you therefore got what, on average, you get 5.4% a year since they first began doing the FT index. And you compound that over a 75-year lifetime until pension age for, his pension age will be 75. You'll have, what, $750,000 or something sitting there waiting for you? It's not bad just for 7,000 initial outlay.
Yeah.
And if you run a currency like that, so that instead of, when you have a current account at the moment, you get no interest at all, but if you had it in talents, you would automatically get the appreciation in the value of the underlying value of the currency, because it would all be fully funded.
So we'll have the Bitcoin debate another day. I disagree that it's a Ponzi. I'm a big supporter of separating money and state. But
so am I, but you can do that by private currencies. You don't have to do it with a Ponzi scheme.
Well, I disagree with the Ponzi scheme, but I do think one area
does it not reward the early investors, and does it not penalise those who come in later?
Well, it doesn't penalise those who come in later.
Of course it does, because the money is made by those who got in early. If you bought Bitcoin, say, 30 years ago, even if you had one of them, you'd now have 100,000, wouldn't you? So,
of course, but
you would have paid a penny for it. So that's a pretty good Ponzi scheme to me.
But it's functionally not a Ponzi scheme. But that's the same if you get in Apple shares early. But we'll save that debate for another day.
Yeah.
But actually, I think one area we may agree on is that I would abolish the Bank of England.
Oh, me too. Yes, absolutely. You'd still have to have some way of organising the national debt. The big problem is actually, rather than shuffling the institutions, we're going to have to tackle the question of the national debt. Now, I had a very simple method of doing this at 10 Downing Street. Anyone who wanted new money, any minister wanted new money, because civil servants are always saying, "Oh, minister, why don't we do this, that, or the other, vanity project? You will look very good when you pull the curtain aside and your name is on the plaque opening this new railway line," whatever it might be. And so I used to have an arrangement by which anyone who wanted new money, it had to come across my desk before it went to the cabinet. 98% of them I rejected for obvious grounds because they were clearly just vanity projects. Within a year of doing that, we were paying back the national debt. Now, it wouldn't be that easy now because the national debt has grown so fast since Margaret's time.
But just get to even would be a good position.
Well, even that would now be very, very difficult because the national debt is now, I forget how many trillions it is. It keeps changing.
2.8 trillion,
each time
is it,
you look.
Connor?
It's 3 trillion, I think, now. It's just horrendous.
Yeah.
And it's way over 100%.
3.1 trillion.
Yeah.
Nearly 3.2 trillion.
It's way over. There's the
Over 100% of
debt
GDP.
ticker,
Yeah.
Yes, it's. You're very good on that computer, I must say, calling up this information. Congratulations, but it's indecently large.
Yeah.
And the sacrifices that would now have to be made to get that under control would hit everybody, and that would require very careful management. And we are now working on trying to find a way of doing this, trying to foresee how fast that will grow under a communist government, because the trouble with communist governments is that they actually want to destroy the economy. It is not an accident what they're doing. It's not incompetence. They know perfectly well, for instance, that taxation of rich people is an internationally competitive business. I didn't finish telling you the story of what happened when we got rid of the IRA, thanks to that statesmanlike move by Garret FitzGerald of giving us the Anglo-Irish Agreement. And once we'd got that agreement, that was the end of communism in Ireland, because all the communists had focused their energy on the IRA.
I think it's come back recently.
It has come back since. But during that golden age when there wasn't any communism, yes, there was a much milder form of socialism that wasn't really ever going to be communism. They were able to agree among themselves, among all parties, that it would be a good idea if they set their corporation tax lower than anywhere else in the world.
They got penalised for it, didn't they? No, the companies did.
But the benefit
I know, it's huge.
that they got was so huge that even now, I think until the immigration thing began to hit them really badly, they were the only country in Europe that was running an annual surplus rather than a deficit, because all the big tech companies, your Apples and your Googles, and they all had their international headquarters in Ireland. Why Ireland? Not only because the tax rate was low, but because there were no communists to start changing the policy later.
The thing that always fascinated
And that's
me...
why they were all willing to go there.
Yeah.
You see, our problem here in this country is that while you still have a communist regime in the shape of the Labour Party, a country, even if we were now, supposing Reform were now to get in, they say, right, we will have corporation tax at 5 or 7% or whatever the lowest rate is, that would no longer tempt the companies that are now in Ireland to come to Britain, because they know we have this hideous communist party which would change it all just because they deliberately want to wreck the British economy. It's not a matter of accident. Do you suppose that even Rachel Reeves, even though she's what we call in Yorkshire thick as two short planks, the fact is she knows perfectly well that if you tax the non-doms to force them overseas and force all the billionaires and millionaires and all their companies with them overseas, that is going to lose you revenue. She knew that when she taxed the private schools, that would mean all the private school kids are going to have to come into the public schools, and she was going to lose revenue on it. She didn't care, because it's all about destroy, 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 kill, kill, kill. That's what communism is all about. They know what they're doing. They are working with hostile actors and foreign regimes that do not wish us well. Because the Labour Party does not wish this country well, they wish to destroy us. Until you understand that, you understand nothing. That's the trouble we're facing here. They really mean us harm. And we have to love them all the same. And we have to try to show them that it's so much better if you don't mean us harm. And if instead we have a free market and we have low taxes, small government, and then we spend the money only where it really has to be spent. We need to spend more on defence, and not just by shuffling it around so you're pretending you're spending 5% of GDP when all you're doing is saying that rural broadband counts towards defence spending, which is a sort of trick they're using at the moment. They're going to have to spend more on welfare, unfortunately, until we get that sorted out. And so, it's not going to be easy to balance the budget. The aim should be to balance the budget, but the Labour Party isn't even trying. They're trying to make the budget even more unbalanced until the whole system collapses, because it's only when they can force it to collapse that they will then say that capitalism has failed and we must now have communism red in tooth and claw. And I can tell you, if you're the working people of this country, if they get away with that, you will not like it. You will suffer first and worst, because those who are rich enough and smart enough to see it coming will have got out with as much of their wealth as they can before it happens. But you won't be given that luxury. You will be trapped here in the misery that is communism. And that is what we face unless we can persuade the Labour Party to stop being communist.
Good luck.
And that's not easy.
It's not easy.
They're so wedded to the destruction of this country. But we have been tame in not saying this. We have kind of almost assumed that they are a legitimate political party just like the rest of us and they all mean well. They don't mean well. They mean this country harm. They have an ideology that comes well before any mere individual comrade or citizen of this country. They do not understand the value of the individual because they do not love the individual. They are not a cult of love. They are part of the nastiest cult of hatred that has ever existed on this planet. And until that changes, no one should ever, ever, ever vote for the Labour Party.
Feels like a place to round up. Thank you so much. I want to do this again. I've so many more questions for you. We should definitely do this again.
I should love to do it.
Yeah, incredible. I really enjoyed this, and yeah. So every now and again, I have an interview which affects me. I have to go away and have a little think, and this is certainly one of them. Yeah, what a pleasure and an honour to interview and spend a couple of hours with you.
Well, bless you for that. And Connor, marks out of 10.
10 out of 10, man.
This is about probably my favourite interview we've done.
It's like when you...
I've loved it, every second of it.
Well, how very kind you both are. I have really enjoyed myself. As you know, all you have to do is, there is no off switch. You just fire a question at me and I rabbit.
Yeah.
But to those who are kind enough to be watching or listening to this, God bless you for spending so much time with us here today. And do come back if we get the chance to do it again. I should regard it as a great honour.
Yeah.
Because, you are the guy that showed Joe Rogan how to do this. And so, and you do it, if I may say, far better and far more engagingly and far more intelligently even than he does. And that is very high praise indeed, because he's no slouch at it.
No, you're very kind. You're very kind. Well, we should do it again. We should do it once with David Starkey. That would be
huge fun. I regard him as a very, very important figure at this time, because he has that historical perspective and has done what all the best historians do. He has pondered these things in his heart, to use the biblical phrase that was used by our Blessed Lady. When she heard what the Lord of Life said, she then thought about it. And that's what he can't just do dates, and he does them very well, but he's thought about what history means. And he too has this deep, abiding, passionate love for this country and of our Constitution of Liberty. And he is weeping with frustration, as you know, because you've talked to him, at the way that it has been so carelessly thrown away and with so little opposition from the so-called Conservative Party. And this is a tragedy. And I am hoping that Reform, via its new policy unit, will be doing more on this front to reverse the hideous Blair reforms, to put back a proper top-level court, which isn't just full of communists, and is once again going to follow the ancient judicial principles. And what are they founded upon? Well, the great thing about the law, and this, if you ever read the Institutes of Justinian, and they're a very short summary of Roman law during the later empire. And the Emperor Justinian decided that he would codify Roman law, and then he produced a short version of his codification, which was called the Institutes, and that was for law students. And he starts out, almost right at the beginning, quoting Cicero, a great lawyer at the end of the Roman Republic, and some even blame Cicero for having brought the Republic to an end, which is not fair to him. But Cicero, quoted by Justinian, said this: "The law is, or ought to be, founded upon and rooted in love." See, even in the immediate pre-Christian and post-Christian era, they knew the importance of love. That is what the law is for. It is not to provoke conflicts, but to resolve them peacefully. That's what the law is for, and we've got to make sure it gets back to that. Because if lawyers concentrated on that precept of Cicero and Justinian, then I think people would not have the contempt for them that they tend to have to this day. So let us put love back at the heart of politics, of law, of justice, and of business, because that's what the free market is. It's a market in which we trust our neighbours enough to allow that cheerful chaos that is the free market. And it is a joyful thing. It's a messy thing. It's an untidy thing. No totalitarian, no thanatist understands it or has any sympathy with it at all. They can't think why it works so well. They cannot bring themselves to imitate it. And yet, it is the most brilliant way ever devised to spread wealth. As Francis Bacon used to say, money is like muck, not good except it be spread. And that's a very good precept. Have you read Francis Bacon's essays?
No, but I'm a fan of his artwork.
Well, then, no, this is the ancient Francis Bacon.
I was like, is this the same guy?
And no, not the artist. We're going back now a few hundred years. He was a philosopher and a politician, and his essays are essential reading for anyone who wants to understand how politics works. The book is short. Each essay is short. If you read Latin, read them in the original Latin because it's very vigorous. But if not, there's a wonderful standard translation done, I think, by a 17th century schoolmaster in very robust English, and it's cracking good reading.
Well, I tend to read everything recommended to me. My bookshelf is going quicker than I can get through them.
I have the same problem. I have 4,000 books in mine.
Wow.
So Francis Bacon's essays are an absolute must. You'll read them in a single night because they're that captivating.
Okay.
And my goodness, he's so good. For instance, he talks about defence. Walled towns, stored arsenals, and the like, be as nothing, except the spirit of the people be stout and warlike.
Thank you so much. This has been an absolute pleasure. We will do it again, and we'll do it one day also with Mr. Starkey, because I think that will be a lot of fun. But thank you, and keep up the good fight.
And thank you for everything that you do, because you are one of the very, very few voices that is allowing alternatives to the cloying Communist Party line on just about everything still to be heard in this country, precisely because the office of communism has not yet found a way of getting its clutches on you and finding a way to interfere.
We've tried to get people from the Labour Party on. It's very difficult. They don't want to talk. They don't have.
Of course they don't. And this is the great hope. In fact, this is really the best note of all I think we might finish on. That is this, that the campaign against free speech, which has been growing to my great distress in the universities and now in politics, comes entirely from the Thanatist left. Why? Because who is it that does not wish to debate? It is the person who knows, and knows with a bitterness in his heart, that if he were to debate, he would definitely lose. So just at the moment when the Thanatist cult thinks that it is triumphing throughout the West, it is in fact on the verge of utter collapse, because everything for which it stands, if the people understood what it was up to, they would not like it, and therefore, if they were to debate, they would expose what they were really up to, the people would not like it, and they would lose that debate. That is why the communists won't debate. It is because they now know that everything they do is held justifiably in contempt by the great majority of the British people. They have lost the argument. And once you lose the argument, it's only a matter of time before you just lose. Full stop.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for listening. I can't wait for the comments. See you all soon.